Think Forward. Think Research Channel.
The opinions expressed in the following program are strictly those of the speaker. They do not necessarily reflect the views of the National Science Foundation.
From the National Science Foundation, where discoveries begin. This is Frontier, discussions of today's most exciting research subjects by distinguished scientists and engineers working at the frontiers of knowledge.
It's great to be here, and certainly an honor, and thank you very much, Mary. But I'm going to start by asking sincerely for your indulgence as I engage briefly in a bit of wild speculation. I know very well that wild speculation can get boring fast, so I promise I'll try to be quick about it. But let us suppose, due to some perfectly ordinary, though long-term evolutionary process, that we humans have acquired, and thus are born with, an intuitive psyche, a set of mental and emotional systems that looks roughly like this. A, we're very visually oriented. B, we tend to imagine a personal and linear format to the near chaos of life experience, enough so that once we as a species had acquired language, let's say 50,000 years ago, we found that we like to tell and hear stories, personal narratives. And C, we are by nature very, very subjective creatures, meaning that we tend to see the world as turning powerfully around ourselves. So that's a three-part model. Maybe it's a highly simplified version of the intuitive human psyche that I like to imagine. It's a gift of evolution, the psyche we're born with. We're visual, narratively inclined, and very subjective. This model of the intuitive psyche might help explain astrology. A bunch of Sumerian shepherds are tending sheep and getting bored. They incidentally spend their nights looking up at the stars. As they look up at the stars, they visually draw some lines between the dots and they see little pictures. They tell each other stories about the pictures. And these stories have as their abiding theme the idea that you and I, every human being in the universe, is situated dead center in the universe, with the entire universe spinning around us and casting down its mysterious and wonderful influence onto our subjective selves like sweet honey. Astrology is a very, very comforting concept because it so nicely conforms to the needs and expectations of our intuitive psyche, the mind that nature gave us. Anyway, that was a bit of evolutionary speculation, and I want to follow it up with a bit of historical speculation. Let's imagine that historically, some people with time on their hands thought that they might tinker with the intuitive way of knowing, improve it for practical purposes by setting down the strange concept of A, objectivity, the somewhat formal idea that there is a truth beyond the self, and B, maybe a few formal rules for logical discourse. Let's say that these people were developing such a concept and such rules a very short time ago, only maybe 100 generations or 25 centuries ago, very roughly around the time of Aristotle, Socrates, and Plato. Let's also imagine that during this same general period, slightly earlier, perhaps around the time of Pythagoras, some other people, also with time on their hands, were considering the strange relationship between tangible reality and numbers. And they began treating mathematics as if it were a secondary language, a second way to conduct logical discourse. Then let's imagine a short lapse of time, a few historical moments, whereupon these techniques for knowing, this mental toolkit, the stance of objectivity, the rules for logical analysis in language and the secondary language of numbers, were supplemented by some new mental tools. Maybe we can say this happened very roughly around the time of Francis Bacon in 17th century England, when more people with more time on their hands developed some more formal techniques, new tools that might produce a more rigorous style of logical thinking. These techniques might include formalized observation and methodical data gathering, the creation of hypotheses and experimentation, and an almost ritualized sort of permanent skepticism. Altogether, these pretty modest little mental tools But let's think of them as, in combination, as a little mental toolkit called the scientific toolkit. Now, we might imagine that these two ways of knowing, the intuitive psyche that I talked about and the scientific toolkit, are in total opposition. And when we compare them, conceptualized at their simplest, they do seem to be complete opposites. We have visual versus numerical, narrative versus analytical, subjective versus objective, and so on. And you know, when you think of astronomy, astrology is an example of intuitive knowing, and astronomy is an example of scientific knowing, then it seems to confirm this idea of a total opposition between these two modalities of thinking. And certainly one of the great accomplishments of science, the science of astronomy, is that it has convinced a lot of people who are not astronomers that astrology is wrong, dead wrong, fundamentally wrong, absolutely wrong, for some very basic reasons. For some people, at least, astronomy wiped out any small appreciation they might have had for astrology. But the science of astronomy has done that ultimately not by destroying our intuitive psyches. They cannot be destroyed, but rather by appealing to our intuitive psyches, by showing us that there are good alternative visual images, by giving us an alternative narrative, by creating an alternative sort of world with an alternative place for subjectivity. If we are no longer lucky selves living at the very center of the universe with the universe spinning around us, we are at least very interesting selves looking out from the small end of a big telescope and thinking deeply about what we seem to see. Every high school science teacher has the same problem as astronomers have encountering astrology. Every high school science teacher is dealing with people who are fundamentally intuitive thinkers. We all are. And the science teacher's goal is not to wipe out the intuitive way of knowing, that would be impossible, but rather to present scientific knowing in a manner that appeals to, that won't be rejected by, that can be absorbed by the intuitive psyche. It's the same problem every popular science magazine has. Popular science, popularizing science, means very simply presenting scientific knowledge in a style that can be grasped by, or that will not be instantly rejected by, people who are fundamentally intuitive thinkers with possibly small or limited training in the scientific mental toolkit. Popular science magazines make this presentation by, first of all, giving lots of pictures, lots of appeal to the visual aspect of intuitive knowing. Secondly, by making little or no appeal to logic through mathematics, which is still a foreign language to most people. Thirdly, by presenting the material in large part as personal narrative, as a story, rather than as formal logical analysis. And finally, by presenting that material with a subjective edge, asking and answering the question, what might this new research mean for the reader himself or herself personally? If a popular science magazine does this sort of thing well, very well, for a long enough time, it might turn into something as successful as, say, the National Geographic. Okay, so that was a bit of wild speculation, and I ask your forgiveness for it. And forgive me again, because I'm going to give you another shorter bit of wild speculation. Let's imagine that in our own evolutionary history, we have been visually oriented creatures, visual knowers of the world for a very, very long time. Much longer than we were storytellers, and certainly vastly long before the start of the historical record. As a result, perhaps, we might imagine that visual thinking has a certain primacy in the intuitive psyche. The primacy of visual knowledge might help explain that certain class of images that, perhaps because of simplicity, repetition, and emotional association, have a concentrated and powerful and pre-logical and even pre-narrative effect. We call these sorts of images icons. Think of a flag, think of a cross, think of a swastika, think of a ponytail. I'm joking about the ponytail, but I was not joking about the National Geographic. And in Jane Goodall, that young woman with her hair tied up in a ponytail, who in 1960 went with verve and total courage where big and very tough men were afraid to go, into the African forest where the wild chimpanzees lived, the National Geographic found its perfect foil. Yes, she had done something that seemed from the very first like breakthrough science. It was breakthrough science. Yes, she had done something that showed a new style, a new method, a new approach, and that presented new parameters and new dimensions to the developing sciences of ethology and primatology. But at least its significance was her amazing congruence in style with the style of the National Geographic for presenting science. While the Geographic gave a largely visual presentation, for example, Jane Goodall was the perfect subject with a model's poise and photogenic appeal, with a series of arrestic images showing her as the beauty living so casually among genuinely dangerous beasts. And while the Geographic preferred its already limited text to be almost entirely narrative, Jane Goodall was a gifted narrator, and she had an astonishing story to tell. The young secretary who, through her own powerful courage and passion, successfully went off into the wilds of Africa and broke the secret code of chimpanzee life. And while the Geographic liked to emphasize a subjective edge to things, Jane Goodall's story had a powerfully subjective aspect. Most of what she accomplished, she did in large part alone or nearly alone. And so, thus, she sat at the very center of her little universe in the woods. Even the chimps, in some sense, could be understood subjectively. Jane Goodall thought of them as having emotions, personalities, and minds, so that the chimpanzees themselves were subjective beings. Certainly, in any case, we can say it was a good match, Jane Goodall and the National Geographic. And the Geographic, through its massive modern media machinery of imagery production, to some degree turned a very accomplished and charismatic person who has achieved much into a famous person and even, in some sense, an icon. The limitations of iconography, or being an icon, are perhaps three. One is that icons tend to be one-dimensional, and therefore, in that sense, limiting. A second is that some people find icons automatically suspect. Science is supposed to be a quiet, collectively analytical enterprise, a very serious one. Science is not about stories, it's not about ego, science is not about individuals. So maybe the thinking goes like this: if she's really so smart, why isn't she boring? Or if it's really great science, why isn't it boring? And the third problem is that icons attract iconoclasts, the kind of people who are not really interested in whether you're right or wrong, good or bad, wise or foolish, but who will attack you simply because you're famous and charismatic. You all know Jane, and virtually everyone in the world knows Jane Goodall through a series of images and through a series of stories. I got started in this business a long time ago. I was an English major in college and graduate school. And when I completed graduate school, I decided I would be a writer. I think I wanted to be, probably deep down, wanted to be a fiction writer. I was certainly envious of the fact that fiction writers can make things up. If they don't like something, they make up something else. Temperamentally, I think I was more inclined to be a nonfiction writer, but I told myself when I started, well, at least if I can't make things up, I can at least decide what I'm going to write about, and write about whatever interests me. Thus, my first book was about psychiatry and psychiatric history. Thus, my second book was about computers, and thus my sixth book was about primates. I actually didn't really know what a primate was when I started my sixth book. I had a vague idea, monkeys, apes, lemurs, forests, furry, cute, and from that I started learning about primates. I did some library research and learned sort of some of the technical background of primates. And I also had a couple of wonderful grants. And with those grants, I started my serious research, which was I traveled around the world by myself in a rather quixotic attempt to find the world's 12 most endangered primates in their tropical forest homes. Thus, I went to southeastern Brazil, and I sailed down the Amazon River and went into the Amazon rainforest. Thus, I went to West and Central and East Africa, to Madagascar, to southern India, Borneo, Sumatra, the Matawi Islands. And I did find the world's 12 most endangered primates. And I did write a book about it, which was finished in 1989. There was a primate that I thought I had wanted to write about, but I was just intimidated by this particular primate species because there's so much known about it and because it's such a complex and fascinating and hauntingly human-like species, and that, of course, is the chimpanzee. So after I had finished my first book on primates, I said to myself, well, I'm going to try the chimpanzee. I'll try writing a book about chimps. But of course, I didn't know anything about chimps, so I sought out a scientific expert. I wanted to get somebody who would at least be willing to read the manuscript once I had finished it and tell me how foolish I had been, or where I was right and where I was wrong. In the process of looking for that expert, I happened to meet Jane Goodall. And as it happened, Jane was actually looking for a writer, and she had in mind a book about chimpanzees as well. So together, the two of us decided to collaborate, and we wrote a book about chimps, the relationship between chimpanzees and people, that was published in 1993. I thought it was a good book. I think it was successful. I think Jane liked the book. But for me, the most exciting thing about doing the book was just working with Jane Goodall. And so I got to know Jane Goodall a little bit over the 2 years that we worked on this book. I got to know a person who is indeed the world's foremost expert in wild chimpanzees. She is a person who is indeed a great scientist who has done revolutionary work and who was, and to some degree still is, the single person most responsible for teaching, inspiring, and launching the next generation of primatologists. She still stands at the very center of that discipline. I also got to know a person who is small and slight and seems frail, but she's tough as nails. She's funny, she's fun-loving, she takes a childlike pleasure in simple things. She's a brilliant storyteller. She's very open with people. She does not prejudge people to an amazing degree. And she also hates the sight and the smell of undercooked runny eggs at the breakfast table. At the same time, I was also becoming aware of the Jane Goodall icon, the ponytail on legs, Beauty versus the Beast, fragile female in the far-off forest, feminist hero, dreamy practitioner of feminine science at war against the grouchy old males of traditional masculine science, and so on. Now, I'm sure you all could probably add to that iconic representation of Jane Goodall. And those are not necessarily wrong things. She is a feminist hero. And maybe there is something to the feminine science idea. I don't know. I haven't thought very deeply about it. But I have noticed, in any case, from being around her, that contrary to what some people will try to tell you, being famous is not so bad. In fact, I think it must be a lot of fun. And I will guess that being a celebrity scientist and an icon is loads of fun. Still, I consider the effects of that Jane Goodall icon, that powerful collection of memorable images by which she is represented to the world, the reality of her for so many people. And I thought in general that it had the unfortunate side effect of exoticizing her. It also, I thought, to some degree, had the effect of devaluing her real accomplishments as a real scientist and an activist. Anyhow, I was having these sorts of thoughts. Around the end of 1995, we had finished our book. I had read a few articles about Jane that had come out. There was a book about Jane that had a couple of chapters. And I thought, this is really not the person I know. This is not the tough, smart, gritty, funny, and accomplished person that I really know as Jane Goodall. And then at the end of 1995, the National Geographic published a biographical piece on Jane. And I remember thinking the same thing about that biographical piece from the Geographic. I thought, this is just, they really haven't done it. As it happened, I ran into Jane about 2 weeks later. She came out to Boston in December of '95 to give a lecture at MIT. Boston is my home, and so after the lecture, I drove her to the airport. And during the ride to the airport, I said, Jane, I really didn't like that book that had a couple of chapters about you. I didn't think it was really a fair representation of you. And I said, I didn't like those articles either. And I thought the National Geographic piece, it was pretty good, but it just didn't quite represent you well enough. And then, continuing on that theme, I said, Jane, I think maybe someday, somebody, very soon, should write a real biography about you. She said, do you think so? And I said, yes, I do. So by the end of the ride to the airport, we had decided that I would write her biography and that she would cooperate. So that was great. The next day I called up my publisher, And I thought he'd be excited about this idea. I said, you know, Harry, I spoke to Jane Goodall yesterday, and we've agreed that I would do her biography. And Harry, being the thoughtful person he was, instead of getting excited, said sort of quietly, you know, Dale, I think of biographies as being about dead people. And I said, well, Harry, you know, she's not dead, but she's over 60. So that was 10 years ago. Now I'm over 60. So I recognize fully how stupid that was. But I didn't recognize it at the time, and Harry did finally agree to do it. So I had a contract, and I started to write this biography. I figured, you know, this is not going to be so difficult. For one thing, I don't have to think about the structure of it. You just start at the beginning, and you write until you reach the end, which is either the death of the subject or when you catch up in present time with the subject. So I figured, fine. Nevertheless, my first goal, I thought, was to really place Jane in the context of her science, in the context of ethology and primatology in the mid-20th century. And that would naturally require that at some point I should insert some historical material and even some analytical discussion of the science and Jane's place in it. In that sense, then, the biography that I was writing might require a scientific mental toolkit, and it might be called a scientific biography. And yet, of course, a biography is all about storytelling, that old personal narrative that we all find so intuitively appealing. I wasn't really writing a science book. I was rather telling a story, a life story, which meant as much as possible that almost everything, all the facts, all the data, had to be placed in a narrative context. Ideally, I thought to myself, a biography should seem as close to a novel as it possibly can. But of course, a biography is not a novel. For one thing, it should be true, sort of. And to get at the truth, you have to use that old scientific approach of observation, data gathering, hypothesis making, and so on. And you should be washing it all down regularly and routinely with a professional and industrial dose of skepticism. So even though you as a biographer might wish to appeal directly to the intuitive psyche of your readers, you are still very concerned about getting the literal factual truth. You want the details, you want the facts, you want the data. And in that sense, the fact that my subject was still alive and not dead proved to be a wonderful stroke of luck, not only for her, of course, but for me. Lots and lots of data were readily available. To start with, there were endless interviews. I started this book in March of '96. I went to visit Jane at her family home, and we sat down with a tape recorder and started a series of interviews that basically continued for the next 10 years. Moreover, the fact that she was still alive meant I could call her up on the phone and ask her simple questions whenever I had any. Jane, I read in an article that your eyes are blue, but I read in a book that your eyes are brown. What color are your eyes? Hazel. Jane, how much do you weigh? Jane, what's your dress size? Jane, when your father wrote that letter to your mother asking for a divorce, what did you feel about that? Jane, you've seen a lot of sex among the chimps. Has it ever seemed erotic to you? I was also lucky that I started when I did, when she was not only alive, but also very young, because so many very, very important people in her life were still alive. Her mother, her father, her aunt, her nanny, her first husband. All of these people are gone now, and so I had the good fortune of meeting them and interviewing them when I could. I was also lucky because of another piece of serendipity, the happenstance that her family collected everything, saved everything, so that there were vast quantities of artifacts. For example, if you go into the family home in England and you go up into the room that was Jane Goodall's childhood bedroom and her adolescent bedroom, there's a bookcase there that still has all the books that she read as a child and an adolescent. You can sit down and read them if you wish. For example, Jane wrote many diaries and journals. As a young girl, she was a prolific, very active diarist. So you can follow the progress of her adolescence. I know the date when she had her first pair of stockings, and I know what she thought about them. There was another thing that the family saved, and in fact everybody else saved, whoever knew Jane, and that was all her personal letters. She was a brilliant was a brilliant letter writer, so much so that even as a child, when she would write letters to other people, they saved them for some strange reason. They were just such wonderful letters. I began to realize this when her mother came down for breakfast one morning when I was visiting the family with a bundle in her arms, and she put it in front of me. Dale, perhaps you might be interested in these. They were letters, as I looked, personal letters, but they were not merely personal letters from Jane. They were brilliant letters. As I read them, I thought they were funny, they were brilliantly observed, and I realized then that she's as great an observer of people as she is of animals. The only problem was that there were so many of them, and her mother kept discovering them every time I would visit the house. Dale, I found some more letters. Dale, I was looking in my mother's cupboard, and there were some more letters. Pretty soon I had 200, 300, 500, 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 letters that I collected over a couple of years. Some of them 15, 20 pages long. Altogether, I estimate it was about well over 1 million words. And just so this is raw data, okay, and sort of a scientific concept here. And so much material, and she never dated anything, and many of the letters came without postmarks, so that I had an enormous jigsaw puzzle on my mind, and the solution to it was that I hired a team of secretaries who put it all on computer disk, and then I had an assistant, and with the assistant I actually figured out what the dates were it was an enormous jigsaw puzzle. I managed to get the publisher to support this by buying 2 more books, which were 2 volumes of her letters. So we published 2 volumes of her letters, and it was basically the process of my research on the biography. But when I was done, I actually had an office with 12 volumes of her letters, single-spaced, enormous amounts of material, but incredibly useful. So anyway, she had all of these artifacts, all of these wonderful sources of data, and she saved everything. Even, well, I'll tell you, one time I stayed at the house. I went back to my room and crawled into bed and prepared to turn out the light when there was a knock on the door. And it was Jane. Dale, I was wondering if you'd like to sleep with Jubilee. Jubilee is the name of her favorite childhood toy, a toy stuffed chimpanzee with a music box in his stomach that her father gave her when she was 1 year old. And here it was 60 years later, and she still had Jubilee around. Yes, Jane, I'd love to sleep with Jubilee. Anyway, I slept with Jubilee. And there was just this tremendous amount of data, raw information to work with. And I like to flatter myself by thinking that writing that biography had some significant things in common with doing scientific research, just data to gather and assess concepts and theories to hypothesize and be skeptical about, and so on. And another way that writing a biography resembles or seems to resemble doing science is that it has a formal stance of objectivity. An autobiography is subjective. A biography is supposed to be more or less objective. Not only are you trying to see the whole person, peering like a spy into the intimate details of your subject's professional and personal life, peering like a microbiologist through a microscope, but you are trying to see the whole person objectively. You are writing about someone else's person, someone else's self, from an outsider's perspective. And that sounds like a great idea in theory. In practice, it's also obviously a likely source of real tension. When you're writing about a still living person, what if she doesn't like what you write? What if she hates what you write? What if she wants to control what you write? What if she wishes to look over your shoulder and whisper sweet nothings or bitter threats in your ear? Maybe your subject will pull a gun on you, as the baseball legend Ty Cobb did to his biographer, Al Stump. Or maybe instead of a gun, your subject will just pull a lawyer on you, or just a winning smile. Well, that was another way in which I was lucky. Jane and I had no formal understanding, and it never occurred to us that we needed one about our relationship with each other. She never once asked me what I was writing, and I was never even sure that she really cared, nor did we have ever any idea at all that she had any rights over the matter or any expectations. And she never attempted to get to me to see things her way, or even to find out, even to present to me what her way of seeing things was. She just gave total cooperation. I think the closest she came to a comment, an expression of curiosity about what I was doing, happened after I'd been working on this thing for about 10 years. She said, "Dale, when do you think you'll be done?" And I said, "Well, I'll be done when I'm done." She said, "Dale, you're really waiting for me to die, aren't you?" I know she was joking, and we both laughed. But anyway, I decided that, in the end, that it would be a simple courtesy to let her review the manuscript, and I also realized at the end that, you know, she would be able to give me factual corrections for any errors I might have made. So when I finished it, I sent one copy of the manuscript to Harry Foster at Houghton Mifflin, and I said, "Dear Harry, here it is, hope you like it." I sent another copy to Jane. I said, "Dear Jane, here it is, let me know if there are any errors in it." Then after that, I was just so relieved to be done. As it happened, about 3 weeks later, I was invited to go to Paris, where Jane was receiving being inducted into the French Legion of Honor. It was a great honor for her and a wonderful event, and I thought I would go. And I looked forward to it tremendously, in part because it would be the first time that I could be with her without a tape recorder and without the responsibility of taking notes or even thinking very deeply about what was going on. So I went. And it was fun. I stayed in the same hotel that Jane stayed in, and on the day that she received this wonderful award, the morning she received some kind of prize from UNESCO, which was a big event. Lots of snacks, which I ate, and then in the evening or the afternoon, we all went to the Prime Minister's palace and went through enormous security, and then Jane was stabbed in the chest by the Prime Minister himself, who was giving her this beautiful ribbon. And afterwards, Jane went off for dinner with the Prince of Monaco, and I went off for dinner with, you know, my boring self. And we met about midnight. We all met up in the hotel room, and Jane was there in the room, and her sister was there, and her personal assistant, and a couple of other people. And it was just kind of a time to wind down and compare notes and sort of relax a little bit. So we all had a bit of scotch, and I was kind of drifting a bit, so I didn't really realize that Jane was talking to me at first. But she was saying, a lot of these journalists, they write about me, and they say, my hair is gray. And I don't like that. It's not because I'm vain, because I'm not vain. Because it's not accurate. My hair is not gray. Is it, Dale? I looked over, and it looked kind of gray to me. But I obviously was being put on the spot, so I said, well, you know, it's kind of, Dale, what color is my hair? Well, Jane, it looks kind of silvery to me. And Dale, tell me what color my hair is. And she got up off the bed where she was sitting, and she walked over to where I was sitting. And she reached back and took the clip out of her ponytail, and her hair fell down over her shoulders. And I realized this was the first time I'd seen her in the 17 years that I'd known her with her hair out of the ponytail. And it was beautiful. It's, you know, wonderful, thick, full hair. It reminded me of the Hester Prynne in The Scarlet Letter, that wonderful moment when she lets down her hair. She said, Dale, what color is my hair? Well, I said, you know, Jane, it's got this kind of white frame around your face, and then it becomes gray, and then I started reaching into her hair. Then it turns silver, and then I started really reaching into her hair. And I said, well, it's brown here, and there are flecks of blonde in your hair. Thank you, Dale, she said, and she put her hair back in the ponytail, and then she went and sat back down. So, if you buy my book, which I hope you will do, and if you turn to the first page and look at the second sentence, you will see that I got the color of her hair exactly accurate. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let me thank you for coming here, and let me add a special welcome to all the teachers and students that I see in the audience. I'm delighted that you are here. Well, we'll talk about polymers and plastics. And plastics, of course, that's well-known stuff for you, right? Plastics are human-made materials which can be formed into any kind of shape, and they're some of the most common objects in our daily lives. But what are polymers? Polymers are simply the molecules out of which plastics are made. Everything is made out of molecules, and the molecules that plastics are made of are really very, very special. They have some unique properties, and I'll tell you about them halfway through my talk. But let's start with plastics. You know, plastics are so common that people take them for granted, and certainly they're not considered high-tech objects, right? On the other hand, just think of a high-tech object like a computer. Would you be able to use your computer if you had to plug it in with a cable that looked like this? You know? What would we do without plastic insulation, right? We wouldn't be able to use any electrical equipment, no electronics, nothing. Well, these days, plastics aren't just passive insulators in terms of electricity. Scientists have been able to develop new kinds of polymers and plastics that are electrically active, that you can make transistors out of them, or lasers, or light-emitting diodes, or photocells. And these things can be processed just like regular plastics. You can dissolve them in some solvent and print them on a plastic sheet. You can actually stamp them on big pieces of plastic. You can use an inkjet printer to print them. And you get advantages like what you see here. You have a flexible sheet with all kinds of electronics, and these things are going to affect our lives in the future. There are going to be all kinds of fun products coming out of them. The first one that is going to be in the market probably next year is electronic books. You're going to have basically just a thin sheet of plastic like this, framed of course and solid, and you will tap on it and you're going to see the page of a book. And you tap again, you see the next page, and you can read an entire book or 100 books, all of them just sitting on one sheet of plastic. You can have essentially a library on one sheet of plastic. Now, the ultimate goal is to be able to make a plastic computer, something that would be just a thin sheet of plastic and would have the keyboard and the screen. You'd be able to roll it and put it in your own pocket. Well, that's still a few years away. It will look like a fat pen, something like that, but you'll be able to pull out the handle, and you'll have a small plastic piece. You can clip it and make it stay out and tap and do some rather rudimentary calculations. But very soon, we hope that we're going to have plastic computers. One of the advantages of plastics is that you can mold them and shape them into any size and any shape. So in Europe, there are already billboards and, you know, street signs made out of them. And it won't be long before you may decide to use these kinds of materials as wallpaper in your living room. And then choose one day. Do I want to look out at the Eiffel Tower? Or do I want to look at a peaceful forest scene or the ocean or whatever? You'll just click on it, just as you change your desktop on your computer. Well, not only can you make plastics in very large sizes, but you can also make them very, very small. And because they can take any shape you want, they are going to be on all kinds of products. And these are the things that are going to affect our lives very, very significantly. Plastics can be shaped into all kinds of shape, but not just rigid shapes like that. They can also be made into fibers. This is a soda bottle, as you all recognize. It's made out of a plastic we call polyester, but you also have heard of polyester in clothes. It's, you know, most clothes that we wear are usually blends of polyester with cotton or with wool. So just as you can weave plastics into fibers, you can do the same thing with these new electronic plastics. So what people are trying to do is weave them in a special way, so wherever the fibers intersect, you can have an electronic element, like a transistor or like a light-emitting diode. And then, in a few days, you may be able to have electronic clothing. You may decide, you know, I'm tired of this dress in blue. how about if I change it to red? Now that may sound simple and frivolous, but there are going to be other things that will be much more important, and one of them is called chameleon clothing. What does that mean? The army is very interested in that. It would be the same kind of electronic clothing, but on your back you're going to have a tiny computer camera or more. It's going to record the scenery behind you, and it is going to project it onto your clothing. So you will blend with the background just like a chameleon. And when you move around, of course, the scenery will change in front of you. So other than your face, you'd be almost invisible. And as I said, the army is very interested in that. Well, these are just some examples of the, fun and fascinating things that are coming from these new electronic plastics. So I'll just mention a couple of examples, say in the field of medicine. Just think of angioplasty, right? Hundreds of thousands of lives are saved every year because of angioplasty. If you've had a heart attack or you have clogged arteries, people insert a very thin plastic catheter, goes all the way to the clogged artery. There is a thin plastic balloon at the end. It's inflated, opens up the artery, and does the job. Think about the tens of thousands of lives that are being saved by colonoscopies these days. Can you imagine colonoscopy without a flexible plastic instrument? These things didn't exist before. Think about all the implants that we have in our bodies, knee joints and hip joints. These are generally made out of plastic and metal. Think about artificial skin, which actually exists, and people are trying to perfect it. This is a thin plastic sheet that you can put on burn victims. It does a number of things. First of all, it protects the area from infection. It allows the skin underneath to grow. It nourishes it. It provides a scaffold for the cells to grow. And what we're trying to do is actually make this stuff essentially be absorbed or degrade and disappear as the new skin comes up. And that really is saving, lives already. And then another thing where plastics are going to make a difference in chemistry is in smart medicines. Even now, you have pills that are smart, but not as smart as they can be. For example, many of us take aspirin every day. Well, aspirin irritates the stomach. It can cause stomach bleeding, even death. So you can buy so-called enteric-coated aspirin. What is it? Just an aspirin pill, but coated by a special kind of plastic, which resists all the strong acids in your stomach. So the aspirin isn't released in your stomach. It goes straight through to your intestines, and it is released there, where it can do no damage. That's very simple these days. The really smart pills that are going to be coming up, we don't know when, but lots of scientists are working on them, are going to have the following capabilities, which are really amazing. They're going to have a chemical unit that is going to be able to seek out, say, cancer cells and go straight to them. And then on another part of the plastic molecule, there is going to be a chemotherapy agent, which is going to attack the cell directly. So rather than flooding our bodies with chemotherapy, which, as you know, has terrible side effects, we'd be able to have targeted drug delivery, so almost like sending a silver bullet directly to each cancer cell. And that is still far in the future, but scientists are working at it, and I think we will see it one day. So all of these are just examples of the really high-tech potential applications of plastics. But I'm sure by now you're wondering, so what is it about plastics that allows them to have all these very disparate and fascinating properties and uses? Well, the answer is their molecules. Remember, everything is made out of molecules, and as I told you at the beginning, the molecules of plastics really are very special. Here's why. Let's take a molecule that we all know, say, molecule of water. Everybody knows water is H2O, right? That means 2 hydrogen atoms, 1 oxygen atom, all put together into a single molecule. Well, if we had an ultra powerful microscope and were able to look at a single molecule of water, it would look something like, 3 tiny little beads, like 3 pearls stuck together, the 2 hydrogens and the oxygen. If you had the molecules of most other stuff that you are aware of, it would look something like that, a small clump of little atoms. That's what these beads are, and that would be it. Well, polymers are very different. The word polymer itself comes from the Greek, which means many part. The molecules of polymers are not just single beads or pearls, they're entire chains of atoms strung together, like a pearl necklace. But what a necklace! It goes on and on and on to thousands and thousands, in fact hundreds of thousands of molecules, in fact millions. So that's why Mary called them macromolecules. They're extremely long molecules. So a typical polymer molecule would have hundreds of thousands, even millions of these atoms. And if they were the size that I show you here, it would be 5 miles long. Now in reality, these molecules, of course, are 10 million times smaller. And that long chain nature of polymer molecules explains many of their special properties. First thing it explains is why they are so flexible and they don't break. If you want to break a piece of plastic, what you have to do is basically cut through all these molecules. You can't separate them individually. They're like an enormous bowl of spaghetti, all entangled and wound together. Right. That's why they don't break like glass, which shatters. The second big advantage that these long molecules have is the following. If you change any of the atoms on that chain, you are going to get a different material with different properties. So let me give you some examples. The most common plastic is called polyethylene. It's the stuff that we make, plastic bags out of. It's the stuff that we make milk bottles out of, or utility bottles. Well, polyethylene is simply a long chain of carbon atoms. Each of these beads would be a carbon atom, and from each of these carbon atoms would hang 2 hydrogen atoms. That's all it is. Okay, take this same chain, strip away the hydrogen atoms, replace them with fluorine atoms. And what happens? You get an entirely new material. It's Teflon. Totally different properties, right? You know Teflon, very slippery, nothing sticks to it, withstands very high temperatures, you can cook in it. Very different from a plastic bag. Another example, start again with polyethylene, okay? Long chain, all carbon atoms. This time keep the hydrogen atoms on each of the carbons, but replace every 4th hydrogen atom with a chlorine atom. And what do you get? You get PVC, or polyvinyl chloride, which is our common vinyl plastics. So the vinyl plumbing in your home, the vinyl siding in your home. If you are of the age that you know about The Graduate, you probably heard that music on vinyl records, remember? And vinyl shower curtains. So all we did is we took every 4th hydrogen atom away, replaced it with a chlorine. And the last example is the following. Take the same polyethylene chain. This time strip away half the hydrogen atoms and replace them with nothing. And what do you get? You get the grandfather of all electrically conducting plastics, the first electrically active plastic called polyacetylene. And this is the stuff for which the scientist who discovered it got the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in the year 2000. All right then, so let's ask the following question. We've known about polymers for only 80 years. The fact that plastics are polymers was really proposed and verified in the 1920s. And in these 80 years, we've been able to make all the kinds of plastics and all the new stuff that I'm talking about. Just imagine, what could nature do? Nature, which has had not 80 years to work with, but has had 500 million years of evolution to work with stuff like that. Well, the answer is nature made essentially everything out of polymers. Nature made all living organisms out of polymers. Now, I know you don't believe me, so let me give you some examples. So go out into nature. Go out and look at a forest. Everything you see is made out of polymers. The trees, the leaves, the flowers, the fruits, the roots, the grass, and the weeds. They're all made out of these long pearl necklace molecules. And you know them by different names. The most common name is cellulose. You've heard of cellulose. That's the most common stuff that you see in plants. Another common polymer in nature is starch. You know it, we eat it, right? Now that's the plant kingdom. How about the animal kingdom? Mostly everything in animals is a polymer. We call those polymers proteins. And what are proteins? The same kind of stuff, but not just carbon atoms. They're carbon, oxygen, and nitrogen atoms. And these proteins make up our heart and our liver, they make up our tissues, they make up our hair, our eyes, our nails. It's all proteins. But wait a minute, you're going to ask me, come on. We know that, everybody knows that 70% of our body is water, right? You've all heard that. So, well, let me ask you then, if that's the case, how come each of us doesn't look like a big puddle of water, you know, like Frosty the Snowman on a sunny afternoon? Well, the answer is precisely because these protein molecules are the ones that keep the water together. They keep them in cells, they keep them in tissues, they provide the framework and the structure to our bodies. Okay? So, since everything in the plant kingdom and mostly everything in the animal kingdom is made out of polymers, then that means that everything we use from nature, or mostly everything, is also made out of polymers. Is your house built out of wood? Then you live in a polymer house. Wood comes from a tree, cellulose, it's a polymer. What about your clothing? Are you aware that everything you wear is made out of a polymer? It could be a human-made polymer, like polyester or nylon or acrylic, or it could be a polymer made by nature, like wool or cotton. They're all polymers. In fact, there are only two ways in which you will not be dressed in polymers. Number one, if you decide to become a medieval knight, right? All metal. Number two, if you decide to become a nudist. But even then, you'll be dressed in polymers because your skin is made out of polymers, proteins. Well, everything we take from nature is polymeric, more or less, and that means also our food is mostly polymeric. Now, not everything that we eat is a polymer. Not everything, just the healthy stuff. What do I mean? Well, you all remember your food pyramid, right? What should we be eating most of all at the base? Stuff that comes from plants, right? Fiber. Okay, so fruits, vegetables, and so on. Just think of fiber. Fiber is good for us. Why is fiber fiber? Well, here it is, because it's made of these long molecules. So the fiber we eat. Right. So fruits, vegetables are polymers. What should we eat next, higher up on the pyramid? Lean protein, you know, lean meat, fish, and so on. Well, protein is a polymer. What should we not eat? We should avoid things like sugars and fats. Well, these aren't polymers. These are the small molecules that I showed you before. So if you were to ask me, my food pyramid would be very simple. Is it a polymer? Go right ahead. Is it not a polymer? Be careful. Of course, I know you're all looking at me and you say, no, he doesn't follow his food pyramid very carefully. I'm afraid you're right. Anyway, the last thing I want to talk to you about is really the molecule that is the essence of our life and the basis of the genetic code of our heredity, and that is DNA. You've all heard it, you all know it. DNA is also a polymer molecule, a very, very long molecule. In fact, it's about 100 million times bigger than typical polymer molecules. And it's not just one long chain, but actually two chains that are intertwined together into what is known as a double helix. And I think many of you know that. This also explains to you, why DNA testing is so, uniquely powerful and successful. When you have 100 million units along every molecule, and each one can be something different within, 4 possible combinations. It is really impossible and inconceivable to have the same sequence of units, along an entire molecule of 100 million units. And this is why every person has his or her own DNA, and it's totally differentiable. Everything that I've been talking to you about is really a field of science called material science. And material science is the science of stuff. Things that, we're all made of. But polymers are not the only materials. There are fascinating stories about all other kinds of materials, such as metals, or glasses, or ceramics, or liquid crystals, or nanotubes, or inorganic and organic materials. The second thing that I want to mention before I finish is about the scientists who bring you all these discoveries. Well, we talked about material scientists, but to do that work, you need scientists of all kinds, and they all work together. You need chemists who are going to design and synthesize and make these special molecules. You need physicists who are going to design the instruments and develop the techniques to probe and characterize them. You need mathematicians who are going to develop the theories and the equations so that you can understand what is happening. And you need, of course, engineers of all kinds. You need chemical engineers to process them into useful shapes. You need electrical engineers to make all the electronic circuits. You need bioengineers to make the implants. You need mechanical engineers. And when it comes to the natural polymers, the polymers in nature, you need, of course, biologists to understand them. And these days, research is done with all of these scientists working together. And this is how these discoveries are made. It's all very interdisciplinary. Anyway, thank you.